A boy was walking home from school in Glasgow's East End when they came for him. He was not a gang member. He was not carrying anything. He was 14 years old, and he was on the wrong street at the wrong time wearing the wrong colors. They caught him at a close mouth on Duke Street, 3 of them. And what they did to him in that close took about 40 seconds. He came out the other end with a deep stab wound in his left arm, his school bag gone, and a message cut into his memory that would last the rest of his life. "You are in Fleet territory now. Get out." The group that put him in that close called themselves the Fleet. And in 1970s Glasgow, that name was not a joke. It was not a threat you brushed off. It was a statement of ownership over streets, corners, school gates, and bus routes that the police and the authorities and every good intention from every council office in the city had failed to protect. The Fleet were not the biggest gang in Glasgow. They were not the oldest. But in the war that defined East End gang culture through the 1970s and into the 1980s, nobody was more present, more territorial, more committed to the idea that their patch was their patch, and everyone else would bleed for it. And the gang that bled most for trying to cross that line was the one they hated most, the one that had come before them, the one that had written its name on every wall from Calton to Bridgeton. The Tongs. Welcome to Blood and Concrete, the channel that goes into the real history of Glasgow's streets. Tonight the story is the Fleet versus the Tongs, one of the longest and most brutal gang rivalries the East End of Glasgow has ever produced. 2 names, dozens of deaths and serious injuries. Hundreds of young men whose lives were bent permanently out of shape by a war they were born into before they were old enough to understand what they were fighting for. This is that war. To understand what the Fleet and the Tongs were fighting over, you have to understand what Glasgow's East End looked like in the 1960s and 1970s, when both gangs were building toward the peak of their conflict. You already know part of the story if you have been following this channel. The old Victorian and Edwardian tenements of the inner East End, Calton, Bridgeton, Dennistoun, Parkhead, were being cleared. The slum clearance program that had started after the war was in full swing by the late 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s. Thousands of families were lifted out of the cramped but familiar tenement streets and relocated. Some went to peripheral housing schemes, Castle Milk, Easterhouse, Drum Chapel. Others were moved into the new high-rise tower blocks that were going up in parts of the inner East End itself. Red Road, Royston Hill, Blue Vale and Whitevale Street towers in Calton itself, looming over the old district where the Tongs had been born. What this movement of people did to gang culture was enormous. It scattered some old gangs, but it also created new ones almost immediately in every place people landed. The housing schemes were not communities. They were collections of strangers from different parts of the city, dropped into concrete towers or low-rise terraces with no pubs, no churches, no community centers, no places to gather. Young men who had grown up in the old tenement streets, where everyone knew everyone, found themselves in new estates where the only people who knew each other were the ones who had come from the same original street and stuck together. Those groups became gangs almost automatically, not because they were criminal, but because territory and loyalty were the only reliable things left. The Tongs had come out of Calton in the early 1960s and spread fast. You know their story from the previous episode on this channel, the name taken from a Hammer horror film about a Chinese secret society. The battle cry, Tongs Ya Bass, spray-painted on every available surface. The franchise spreading across the East End and beyond to a point where the name had taken on a life completely separate from the original Calton crew. By the late 1960s, the Tongs were the dominant name in the East End gang landscape. You could find Tongs affiliates from Calton to Gallowgate to parts of Bridgeton to districts far beyond the original territory. The name was a brand, a flag, a piece of identity so powerful that gangs in other parts of the city created their own Tongs versions just to be associated with that reputation. But reputation creates resistance. The bigger and more dominant the Tongs name became, the more it attracted challenges from other crews who wanted to knock it down. And in the East End of Glasgow in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the most organized and consistent of those challenges came from the Fleet. The name Fleet was not new to Glasgow. You have already seen from the gang lists published in later years that Fleet names attached to many different crews across the city. Scottstown Fleet, Partick Fleet, Paso Fleeto, Young Cranhill Fleeto, Baltic Fleet, Duke Street Fleet. The Fleet name was like the Tongs name in one sense. It was a label that spread, a word that young men in different parts of the city picked up and made their own. But in the context of the Fleet versus Tongs war, the Fleet we are talking about is rooted primarily in the inner East End streets around Duke Street and the districts north of the Gallowgate. Duke Street Fleet. The territories that pressed right up against the edges of Tongland, the name locals gave to the Tongs-controlled area of Calton. Where the Tongs name had come from a film and spread through the romance of an exotic identity, the Fleet name had a colder, more functional quality to it. Speed, movement. A fleet moves fast and hits hard. It does not need mythology behind it. It just needs numbers and nerve. And in the early 1970s, the Fleet had both. The line between Tongs territory and Fleet territory in the East End was not a straight line on a map. It was a living thing, a series of streets and corners and closes where ownership was contested constantly. Calton on one side, Duke Street, and the streets running north of it on the other. Between them, neutral ground that was never truly neutral. Every Friday night that boundary was tested. Every school playground that sat on the edge of the two territories was a flashpoint. Every chip shop and bus stop and park where young men from both sides might encounter each other was a potential incident. The weapons by this point had evolved considerably from the old razor era. Razors were still around, but the 1970s gang fighters' arsenal was broader and in many ways more lethal. Kitchen knives were common, carving knives, Stanley knives with the blade extended. Bayonets bought from army surplus shops on the cheap, or stolen from homes where a grandfather had brought something back from the war. Machetes, swords, lengths of iron pipe, modified weapons with blades hammered through wooden handles, petrol bombs, and some of the more extreme confrontations. Stabbing injuries that would have been survivable in the razor era sometimes were not survivable now. The blade went deeper. The wounds were more internal. Boys bled out in closes and on pavements because the weapon that hit them was designed to penetrate rather than slash. The Glasgow Royal Infirmary Casualty Ward became the unofficial scorekeeper of the Fleet versus Tongs war. How many came in on a Friday night? How many needed surgery? How many did not make it to the weekend? The police response in this era was significant, but consistently struggling to keep pace with the scale of the problem. Strathclyde Police had been formed in 1975, merging the old city of Glasgow Police with the surrounding regional forces. The new force was massive in terms of territory, but the resources never fully matched the challenge of an East End gang scene that could generate incidents across dozens of different streets simultaneously on a weekend. Gang intelligence was gathered. Known faces were watched. Raids on gang gathering points were conducted regularly. But the gangs were embedded in their communities in ways that formal policing could never fully penetrate. Everyone in a Tongs or Fleet Street knew who the police informers were. Everyone knew which pubs the plainclothes officers drank in. The knowledge flowed both ways, and the gangs were often faster at adapting to police pressure than the police were at anticipating gang moves. The conflict between the Fleet and the Tongs played out at multiple levels simultaneously. At the street level, there was the constant grind of encounters, challenges, and retaliations. A Tongs boy stabbed near Duke Street. A Fleet boy slashed on the edge of Calton. A group ambushed at a bus stop on London Road. Each incident created a debt. Each debt demanded a response. The cycle was self-sustaining and almost self-generating. Boys who had never personally chosen to be part of any of it found themselves drawn in simply by where they lived and where they went to school and who their older brothers were. At the school level, the war was particularly poisonous. East End secondary schools in the 1970s sat at the intersections of different gang territories. You might have Tongs-affiliated boys and Fleet-affiliated boys in the same classroom. The hostility that existed on the street came inside with them every morning. Teachers who tried to intervene between gang-connected boys were navigating something they had almost no training or tools to handle. Social workers who visited families spoke later about how normalized the violence had become. Boys talked about stabbings the way other teenagers might talk about a football result, with a matter-of-fact acceptance that told you everything about what daily life was like. At the scheme level, the conflict spread beyond the original East End heartland into the new housing schemes, as both gangs had members who had been relocated with their families into Easterhouse and Shettleston and other East Side areas. In Easterhouse in particular, which already had its own nightmare collection of gangs including the Drummy, the Baltoy, the Provi, and the Agro, the arrival of Tongs and Fleet affiliates from the inner East End added another layer of complexity and violence to a scheme that was already famous across Scotland for being completely out of control. Easterhouse in the 1970s was where the Frankie Vaughan intervention had failed 5 years earlier. The weapons handed in had been replaced within days. The promised facilities had partially materialized, but they had not touched the underlying conditions. By the early 1970s, Easterhouse was widely acknowledged as one of the most dangerous residential areas in Western Europe. Police went in numbers. Ambulances were sometimes reluctant to respond without police escort. Ordinary families locked their doors from early evening. Children were kept inside after dark. In that environment, the Fleet and Tongs names were just two of many operating. But they were the two with the deepest roots in the inner East End tradition of gang warfare. When Fleet boys from the original Duke Street territory encountered Tongs boys from Calton on an Easterhouse street, they were not starting from zero. They were bringing 30 years of accumulated hatred with them into a new landscape. One of the defining features of the Fleet versus Tongs conflict during this period was how ordinary it became in the East End. Not ordinary in the sense of trivial, ordinary in the sense of routine, expected. Part of the rhythm of weekly life. People who grew up in these areas in the 1970s describe a world where gang violence was background noise that occasionally became foreground noise when someone you knew got badly hurt or killed. The rest of the time was just there, like bad weather. You worked around it. You learned which routes to take and which to avoid. You learned what time to be home. You learned which colors not to wear and which words not to say on which streets. The women and mothers of the East End carry a particular kind of history from this period that rarely makes it into the gang documentaries and the true crime narratives. These were women who sent their sons out in the morning not knowing if something would go wrong. who waited for footsteps on the stair on a Friday night with a specific quality of anxiety that only the mothers of gang-age boys in a gang territory fully understood, who sometimes recognized the faces of the boys who had hurt their sons because they lived 3 closes away and had grown up playing on the same street, who had to decide whether to speak to the police or stay quiet, and either decision came with a cost. That domestic texture of fear and survival is the invisible backdrop of the whole Fleet versus Tongs war. The gang fights are the headline. The human cost spread across thousands of families and thousands of individual lives is the real story underneath it. The mid-1970s saw some of the most intense periods of the conflict. Both gangs were at their strongest in terms of numbers and territorial confidence. The Tongs still carried the mythological weight of their famous name and battle cry. The Fleet carried the energy of a crew that had grown up in the shadow of that myth and had spent years proving they were not afraid of it. When those two forces met on a Friday night in the streets between Calton and Duke Street, the confrontations were serious and the injuries were real. Court records from Glasgow Sheriff Court and the High Court through this period document case after case involving young men from both sides. Attempted murder charges for stabbings, serious assault, possession of offensive weapons. The sentences varied. Some drew short terms in young offenders' institutions. Some drew longer sentences. Some came out of Barlinnie or Polmont changed for the better and walked away from gang life. Many came out and went straight back. The institutional experience did not consistently break the cycle because it could not change what was waiting for them when they got home. The same streets, the same territory, the same identity that had been the only meaningful one they had ever had. Youth workers who operated in the East End during this period described the pull of gang identity as something almost gravitational for young men in these districts. If you grew up in a Tongs street, you were a Tongs boy by default. You had not necessarily chosen it in any meaningful sense. You had been born into it the same way you had been born into your religion or your football allegiance. The alternative to accepting that identity was to reject it and live with the consequences of being seen as someone who stood outside the group. In a territory where the group was the only protection available, standing outside it was not a neutral choice. It was a vulnerability. This is why the Fleet versus Tongs conflict was so hard to interrupt from the outside. It was not primarily a rational economic choice that could be altered by offering better options, though better options would absolutely have helped. It was a deep identity structure woven through the social fabric of specific streets in specific districts. You could not simply explain to a 14-year-old Tongs boy that gang membership was statistically dangerous to his life outcomes. He already knew that. He also knew that not being a Tongs boy on a Tongs street carried its own dangers and its own costs. As the 1970s moved into the 1980s, the conflict began to change shape again. Not because the underlying hostility dissolved, but because the East End was about to be hit by something that neither the Fleet nor the Tongs had any framework for managing: heroin. The early 1980s heroin epidemic in Glasgow was not a gradual drift. It was a flood. The drug arrived in the East End through supply chains that ran from London and Liverpool north into Scotland, and it hit communities that had already been weakened by decades of unemployment, deindustrialization, and failed housing policy. It found young men who were already in the habit of risk-taking, already experienced with the pharmacology of alcohol and whatever else was available, and already living in conditions where the future felt abstract and the present felt desperate. The gang structures did not disappear when heroin arrived. They adapted. Some gang members became users and drifted away from the fight because they were too consumed by addiction to maintain the territorial discipline gang life required. Some became dealers, finding that the economics of heroin distribution were far more lucrative than anything protection rackets and petty theft had ever produced. Some became both. The violence did not stop. It changed its character. The Fleet versus Tongs territorial war was joined by violence over drug debt and drug supply. Weapons that had been used to enforce territorial claims were now used to enforce financial ones. The same Calton streets that had produced the original Tongs in 1961 were being devastated by addiction 2 decades later. Tongland, as locals called the Tongs territory, became one of the areas most severely affected by the heroin epidemic. Young men who might, in an earlier decade, have been knife fighters maintaining gang honor were instead spending their days trying to manage a habit that was eating them alive. The gangs did not morally object to this transformation. They incorporated it. The connection between the gang era and the drugs era in Glasgow's East End is not incidental. It is structural. The same conditions of poverty, isolation, and official neglect that produced the Billy Boys and the Norman Conks in the 1920s and 1930s produced the Tongs and the Fleet in the 1960s and 1970s, and produced the heroin epidemic in the 1980s. The names changed. The weapons changed. The particular form of destruction changed. The underlying conditions that drove young men toward any available structure that offered identity and belonging, and the management of powerlessness, remained largely constant. This is what the history of the Fleet versus the Tongs is really about. Not just a gang war, not just an East End postcode dispute settled with knives, but a long-running consequence of a city that built its working-class population into industrial labor, and then when the industry went, left that population in schemes and towers with nothing but each other and the street. The Tongs gave that population a mythology. Tongs Ya Bass was not just a threat. It was a declaration of existence. We are here. This is our ground. We have a name. We have a history. You cannot pretend we do not exist. The Fleet answered that declaration with its own. We are here too. We are faster than you, harder than you, and we are not going anywhere. Between those two declarations, hundreds of young men spent their best years fighting on streets that neither the city nor the country truly wanted to look at. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the classic Fleet versus Tongs confrontations of the 1970s had become part of East End memory rather than East End present tense. The original generation of fighters from both sides had aged out. The drug economy had reorganized the landscape of criminal power. New names were emerging. New feuds were forming around the economics of narcotics rather than the geography of tenement streets. But the names persisted. You can still find Fleet names and Tongs names in the gang listings published by Strathclyde Police and later Police Scotland through the 1990s and 2000s. Duke Street Fleet, Real Calton Tongs, Baltic Fleet, Young Cranhill Fleeto. The names had become genetic, passed from older brothers to younger brothers, from fathers to sons in some cases. The specific content of what the gang did changed from generation to generation. The identity persisted. And in Glasgow's East End, you can still find the ghosts of both names on the walls if you know where to look. Faded spray paint on old stone, scratched letters on a doorframe. The traces of a war that lasted decades and changed thousands of lives, and that the city of Glasgow has been quietly trying to explain and forget and understand all at the same time ever since. The Fleet versus the Tongs. Two names that between them tell you more about what Glasgow was through the second half of the 20th century than any official history or any council report or any documentary about regeneration and renewal. They tell you what happens when you build a city on industrial labor, strip that labor away, and then act surprised when the people left behind build something else in its place, something territorial, something violent, something that at least answers the most basic human need of all, the need to belong somewhere, the need to have a name, the need to say, even when everything else has been taken away, this street is ours. This has been the story of the Fleet versus the Tongs, the war that defined Glasgow's East End for a generation. If you want more deep dives into the real history of British and Scottish gang culture, stories told without flinching, subscribe to Blood and Concrete right now. Hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Because the next story is already coming, and it goes just as deep as this one.